So let's take a look at chapter 14. The quote at the beginning of the chapter, conventional wisdom once held that money doesn't matter. Now there's wide agreement that monetary policies can significantly affect real economic activity in the short run, though only price level in the long run. So that one quote sums up a lot of this chapter. So what was the classic feeling about money and the economy? Give me just a moment. Get my marker. So let's look at some different thoughts about money. So beginning with the classical economists, this would be Adam Smith, David Ricardo, the old school economist, and what was their feeling about money? Money doesn't matter. In the classical system, you can expand the money supply. What does that mean? It means that you have inflation. What does that mean? It means things cost more. Well, the economy will adjust to that. And not only will it adjust to that, it will do so rapidly. Well, maybe things were simpler back then. Maybe it didn't fit that time either. I don't know. But now, do you sign long-term contracts sometimes? We have a legal system and contracts a lot of the time. Yeah. So let's say you sign a contract and it's going to be for 5 years. Well, let's say you have 10% inflation every year of that contract. Are the rates written in, prices written into the contract going to be accurate for the 5-year period? Not at all. So is that going to make a difference in the economy and a difference in things? I bet it is. So in an economy where we have contracts, where we have, for example, union contracts, wages are set for the term of the contract. A lot of them might be for 3 years, for example, and they may have a cost of living adjustment, but usually that's every year. So let's say that you have 10% inflation over that year. Well, what's that mean? Well, when you started getting paid that year, by the time your cost of living adjustment comes around, that money will buy you 10% less than what it otherwise would have. So is that going to affect the economy? Yeah. What about leases? Let's say you lease an apartment to someone. Let's say it's a 1-year lease, and let's say that rate is fixed. Let's say you have 10% inflation during that year. Or if you're the person that issued the lease, are you losing money? Yeah, the purchasing power of what they're paying you at the end of that lease is 10% less than it would have been at the beginning of the lease. So are these things going to matter? Yes, you bet they are. Yeah, yeah. So now, there would certainly, most economists would argue that this classical view that money doesn't matter is not the case. And this was popular up until the time of Keynes. Um, so, um, uh, what about wages? Let's say that you have deflation. Let's say that you restrict the supply of money. Well, what's that going to happen? Instead of decreasing in value, inflation, your money is going to increase in its purchasing power. You'll have deflation. So what's that mean? Well, let's say that you own a business, you have all these people employed, but your prices are falling. Well, before long, what are you going to have to do to the wages that you pay? You're going to have to cut the wages. So let's say that you're an employee at this business, you show up for work one day, let's say that you were making $10 an hour in nominal terms, but now that same $10 that you were making, say, a year ago, $9 will buy the same amount of goods and services because we've had deflation. And your employer, who's facing those falling prices, he can't remain in business if he continues to pay you $10 an hour. So you show up for work one day, and what's he tell you? Well, I'm not going to be able to pay you $10 an hour anymore. This is in nominal terms. I'm going to have to pay you $9 an hour, even though it was the same money in real terms that you were making. What do you think? Are most people going to understand that that's in real terms and be okay with it, or are they going to quit?
Even I understand it, but when you're taking $1 off my hourly wage,
You're going to leave. Okay. So, the classical economist, everybody would know that that's the same money in real terms, and they're going to be okay with that. The classical economists looked at real wages. Well, Keynes came along and he said, maybe that's the case in the long run, in the short run anyway. People look at their nominal wage, not their real wage. People don't have a mind that just constantly equates nominal to real in their mind. Now, over time, they might catch on that we're having inflation or deflation, and they need to make these adjustments. But most people, their mind's not a constant adding machine that equates real to nominal, or nominal back to real. So Keynes came along and he said that money, it certainly can have an effect, but he said that monetary policy is not as effective as so again, we have two different schools of thought. This is from the 1700s up into the 1900s. So it's late 1700s though. But we're talking about over 100 years here, probably 150 years or somewhere thereabouts. So you had, money doesn't matter, and then you move to monetary policy is not as effective as fiscal policy. Now, why would Keynes say that? Well, he talked about a liquidity trap. Let's say that interest rates, you push them down low, Um, but even though they're low, um, would people buy bonds if the rate of interest is low? Why or why not? First, you have to understand something really simple to understand. Would you want to lock yourself in to a long-term bond at a low rate of interest and hold on to that bond for many years? You'd wait for bond prices to come back up, right? So in the meantime, you might hold on to your money in cash. Why? You're waiting on bond prices to come back up. I'm not going to lock myself in at a low interest rate for 30 years. So you could come back, though, and say, well, I'll take this low rate of interest until bond prices come back up. I'll sell this bond, and I'll buy another one. That makes sense? Maybe. Yeah. What if you understand the relationship between bond prices and interest rates? What is that relationship? Talked about, inverse, isn't it? We've talked about that before. So if the bond prices are really low and then they rise, what happens to the value of that bond that you've purchased? Well, if there's an inverse relationship between the price of the bond and the interest rate, as the interest rate rises, what happens to the price of your bond? What you can sell it for. Yeah. If interest rates rise, the prices of the bonds, they come down. Remember, interest rate is the price of the bond is in the denominator when you calculate the interest rate. The interest rate's over here, so if the interest rate comes down, that means the price of the bond has to be, or the interest rate on the bond has to be rising. I'm sorry. The interest rate is, let's say this bond is paying $50 in interest, and it starts out at $1,000. That's how much? 5%, right? Yeah. Now, let's say that this drops to 4% over here. This is still $50. I don't know what this number is going to be, but I can tell you that in order for that to happen, what had to happen over here? And the bond price went up, right? There's an inverse relationship between these. What we were just talking about, though, is the opposite. Let's say you're at 5%, $50 here, $1,000. Say that this goes to 1,200. 50 over 1,200, I don't know what that rate is, but I can tell you that it's, the basic math here, right? 4.2%. Let's see, and if it was, say, $900 instead, you're going to go up over here, not down. So that makes sense. So what's the bond market going to be doing? Interest rates are really low. Well, Keynes said not a whole lot. Why? Well, people aren't going to buy bonds. And he said that they may just hold on to their money. And he called that a liquidity trap. So that's one of the reasons he didn't think that monetary policy was going to be effective. What else? Well, he was writing at the time of a depression that was going on. And let's say that interest rates are low, does that mean that businesses are going to invest? Well, classical economists said, yeah, lower the interest rate, the more they're going to invest. But Keynes came back and said you have to look at the marginal efficiency of capital, is what he called it. Let's say the interest rate is 2%, but you're in the middle of a depression, and people are pessimistic about the future. They look at an investment opportunity, and they say, I might make 1.5% if I make this investment. Well, the interest rate is 2. Are you going to invest? No. So you're still not going to invest. Why? Not because interest rates are too high. It's because the marginal efficiency of capital, the rate that people think they're going to earn on their making the investment, is low. And there's a big role for expectations in that idea. If people are pessimistic, does that change our expectations about the future? Yeah. And did that have to be true? That things are really going to be that bad? No. But if people perceive that things are going to be bad, they expect that things are going to be bad, are they going to stop investing? Yeah, because they're going to revise their marginal efficiency of capital numbers downward. And so, what's the classic Keynesian thing to do? Fiscal policy. He wasn't a big believer in monetary policy. Now, the new Keynesians, they've come around since Milton Friedman, and they're going to be much stronger supporters of monetary policy than the old Keynesians. You've had a long time where, well, you went from money doesn't matter to money is not as effective as fiscal policy. Let's use fiscal policy. And around the beginning in the late 1950s, this is the second paragraph under impact of monetary policy, first page of the chapter. Beginning in the late 1950s, this view was hotly contested by Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman and other economists who later became known as monetarists. The monetarists argued that changes in the money supply had a powerful influence on the economy's output in the short run. But in the long run, monetary policy affected only the general level of prices. So basically, the difference between the monetarist and the classical economist is long run versus short run, right? So money does make a difference in the short run. Now, in the long run, you're back to classical economics. It doesn't make a difference. Things are going to work themselves out in the long run. But what about the short run? Yeah, it matters. If it didn't matter, would any of you have ever heard of Alan Greenspan, who was in charge of the Federal Reserve for many years? No. He could have sat there at the Fed and just changed the supply of money all over the place, and it wouldn't have made any difference. Was that true? No, he would have wrecked the economy doing that, right? So, in the short run, it makes a big difference. So, but in the long run, again, only affects the general level of prices. Furthermore, monetarists argued that erratic monetary policy was the primary source of both economic instability and inflation. You've probably gathered that from the Free to Choose videos that we've watched in class, haven't you? Milton Friedman summarized the monetarist position in his 1967 presidential address to the American Economic Association when he stated, "Every major contraction in this country has been either produced by monetary disorder or greatly exacerbated by monetary disorder. Every major inflation episode has been produced by monetary expansion. What's he talking about? Well, if you're having problems with the economy, usually there's something, it has something to do with monetary policy. And what if you're having inflation? Somebody's putting too much money out there. That's that relationship between the supply of money and the price level. Put too much money out there, and what happens to price levels? They go up. You're having inflation. A modern view of monetary policy emerged from this debate. While minor disagreements remain, most economists now agree that monetary policy exerts an impact on output, employment, inflation, and economic stability. So you're not going to find modern economists that think that money doesn't matter, or that thinks that monetary policy is not an effective tool. And even though some of them may be called Keynesian, most modern economists, they're new Keynesian is what it's called, and they're still Keynesian in their approach and way of thinking. They'll still argue for active policy, but monetary policy, they've taken what Friedman said and adjusted that for being Keynesian in nature. The rational expectationists have also taken some of what they've said and adjusted that with some of their Keynesian views. The outstanding economist for this particular chapter, Milton Friedman, who lived from 1912 to 2006, 1976 recipient of the Nobel Prize, widely regarded as the most influential spokesman for a free market economy in the 20th century. More than anyone else, Friedman developed the modern view of monetary policy. At a time when the role of money was largely ignored by the dominant Keynesian perspective, Friedman almost single-handedly convinced the economics profession that monetary policy exerted a strong impact on the economy. And one of his big works in economics was Monetary History of the United States that he put out in 1963. It's a really thick, huge book that he wrote on the history of monetary policy. It presented a powerful evidence that monetary policy not only mattered, but that it was also a major source of economic instability. The chapter on the Great Contraction illustrated that the Great Depression was primarily, if not exclusively, the result of a perverse monetary policy rather than a defect of market economics. Even his critics eventually concluded that, by and large, his views about the importance of monetary policy were correct. Friedman's popular books, Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose, co-authored with his wife Rose, are classic treatises in support of economic freedom. He had an uncanny ability to connect with both the general public and the brightest in his field. After retiring from the University of Chicago, he went on to spend nearly 3 decades on the faculty of Stanford University. Most people would rate Friedman and John Maynard Keynes as the most influential economists of the 20th century. And so we've gone this morning from money doesn't matter to it's not as effective as fiscal policy to money most certainly does matter. In what? Short run. Yeah. In the short run, it matters. What about the long run? Yeah. Classical economists had it right in the long run. It just affects the price level. But we're usually in the short run. So if if money didn't matter again, is there anybody in here that hasn't heard of Alan Greenspan? You've all heard of him. And we're on the second chairman since him, but he was there for so long and was so popular that I'm just throwing his name out there. So, Ben Bernanke, anybody that hadn't heard of him? And our current chairman hadn't been there that long. So, but the point is you never would have heard of these Federal Reserve chairmen if what they didn't make any difference, and it doesn't matter. So it does matter. So in the short run, in the long run, classical economists had it right. Everything will adjust. But the economy, if you're constantly playing with the supply of money, are you ever going to get to the long run? No, you're just going to have all these economic disturbances. You're always going to be in the short run. So if you'll leave things alone, maybe you'll someday get to the long run. So you're not ever going to. Yeah, maybe you'll. Yeah, if you leave. Yeah. So yeah, the tendency is going to be for them to change it, right? Just like you said. Put cotton candy in a child's hands and say don't eat it, and they're going to eat it, right? But the less you change it, the more likely you are for things to eventually adjust. But if you're constantly changing it, you're just going to always be aggravating the things. It makes a difference whether a policy was anticipated or unanticipated, and the rational expectation as to played a big role in explaining that. So certainly if things are anticipated versus unanticipated, that makes a big difference. The quantity theory of money, that's very important. Equations here need to be familiar with. Our price level, that's P. Y, that's our output. If you take our output and multiply it by the price, what do you get? GDP. This is nominal GDP. And that's also equal, though, to money. That's the money supply times the velocity of money. What's the velocity of money? How many times it changes? Yeah, how many times it changes hands. That's right. So the velocity of money is how many times it changes hands in a given period. And knowing this equation, you can work it into this. The rate of inflation plus the growth rate of real output plus the growth rate of real output is equal to the growth rate of the money supply plus the growth rate of velocity. And why do we need to know that? Turn things around here from what we had in the chapter. It's normally written in the traditional way of writing it. So some things in this text and not really the traditional way that I've done things. And wrong with that. It's the same either way you put it. It's just, I've been doing it this way for many years. So money times its velocity is equal to the price level times our real output. So why do we bring this up? Now, Friedman, Friedman thought that the velocity of money, if not fixed, was at least not changing constantly. Pretty easy to predict. So it changes over time, but it just doesn't constantly fluctuate to a great extent. So if we treat this as fixed, what's this tell us? If the money supply changes, and that doesn't change, that means you affect things over here, doesn't it? Well, in the short run, you can have an effect on Y. In the long run, though, the only effect's going to be on what? The price level. And again, velocity does change over time. For example, when I was a young man, there was no such thing as an automated teller machine. And if you wanted some money to spend over the weekend, it better be what? Cash. You better have some cash in your wallet. So last thing you did Friday afternoon, and the banks closed early back then, by the way. There wasn't anything as extended hours at the bank. So before the bank closed on Friday, you'd better go get some cash. Otherwise, you were looking for someone that would accept and cash a personal check for you, which was difficult to find unless you paid them, a lot. Yeah. Yep, you have to pay them some money for cashing the checks. There were long lines at the bank on Friday. If you didn't want to wait in line, better go Thursday, because the banks closed early. And is that going to affect the velocity of money? Yeah. The structure of how we do things in the economy is going to affect the velocity of money. People use money more efficiently now than they did in the past. You don't hold as much money as you did. Why not? Why? Run down and get some money out of a machine, right? So, money and inflation, again, that's pretty simple. The more money there is, the more inflation there is. The housing crisis of 2008, the Fed did some things that traditionally they haven't done. So you can read through that. I wanted to take a minute, though, to talk about the applications in economics section. For many years, you didn't hear much of Austrian economics, but since the Great Recession, a lot of people are talking about the Austrians. If you follow Ron Paul and Rand Paul, who, by the way, is running for president, you'll hear them talk about Austrian economics. And so if you are looking for a candidate to vote for, whether it be Democrat or Republican or whatever, when they talk about economics, I would like for you to be able to hear what they're saying. For example, if you're listening to Rand Paul and what he's saying, I would like for you to be able to track that back to a school of economics, because a lot of times you can, and then you can listen to that politician and say, hey, that's monetarist. I like monetarism, therefore I might consider him. Or if you're listening to him and he's Keynesian, and you can say, hey, he must be a Keynesian. I like that, so maybe I should vote for him. Or if you hear something they're saying and that's not what you like, you may say, oh, I don't agree with that school of economics. Maybe I won't vote for him. So if you're listening to Rand Paul, a lot of times you might be able to trace that back, though, to the Austrian school. Number of schools of thought in economics. You have a project to do on this topic, by the way, I mentioned earlier. Keynesian, monetarist, and also Austrian. In the wake of the financial crisis, the Austrian theory is becoming more popular because they had a plausible explanation for recent events, particularly in the housing market. Like monetarist, Austrian economists argue that the boom-bust cycle is the result of improper monetary policy undertaken by the Fed, but the two differ with regard to the explanation. The core of the Austrian view is that the market interest rate is one of the most important prices in the economy. And when the central bank manipulates this rate, it distorts the signal sent to borrowers and lenders. In the Austrian view, the interest rate is a key determinant of the time structure of capital and the length of the production process. When interest rates are low, the time structure of production lengthens as longer-term investments become more profitable. On the other hand, when interest rates are high, the time structure of production shortens as the higher interest rates make longer-term investments less attractive. When expansionary monetary policy pushes interest rates to artificially low levels, entrepreneurs will undertake additional investments, but there's no increase in the savings that will provide the income for the purchase of the larger future output. Because of the low interest rates, people will try to increase both investment and consumption at the same time. For a time, the artificially low interest rates will generate an economic boom. Output will increase rapidly and the unemployment rate will decline to a low level. But the boom is not going to be sustainable. Given the economy's resource constraint, the strong demand for both consumption and investment goods is going to eventually lead to inflation. So, you listen to them, they'll talk about malinvestment, what generates malinvestment, distorted interest rates. Who might distort the interest rate? Federal Reserve. So, and we've watched one of these videos previously, but I'll end class by showing another one of these Keynes versus Hayek videos, and maybe you'll remember it being put out there in this format. So we'll wrap class up with this video.
I'm watching you. Lord Keynes, wow, it's such an honor.
Indeed, sir.
Please, just go right on through.